The scream that tore from Gabriella Chen's throat echoed through the abandoned silver mine shaft, swallowed almost instantly by the roar of rushing water that poured through cracks in the ancient tunnel walls. She stumbled backward, her oil lamp sputtering as icy water surged around her ankles, rising with terrifying speed in the narrow chamber where she had foolishly ventured alone. The date was April 15th, 1882, and Gabriella had come to Oroville, California 3 months earlier with her father, a geologist hired to assess the remaining veins in the supposedly depleted Feather River mines. Now, as water climbed past her knees and the lamp's flame danced wildly, she realized her curiosity about the unexplored eastern shaft might cost her everything. Above ground, the spring afternoon sun beat down on the dusty streets of Oroville where James Ashford guided his chestnut mare toward the livery stable after 4 days of herding cattle through the foothills. Dust covered his worn leather chaps, and the stubble on his jaw itched something fierce, but all he could think about was a hot meal and maybe a whiskey at the Silver Dollar Saloon. At 24, James had spent 6 years working ranches throughout California, but he had returned to Oroville because something about the small mining town felt like home, even though he had no family left to speak of. His father had died in a mining accident when James was 12, and his mother had passed from fever 2 winters later, leaving him to make his own way in the world. As he dismounted near the stable, old Frank Morrison came rushing up, his weathered face creased with worry. "James, thank God. You know anything about the old Feather River mine? The Chen girl went down there this morning and hasn't come back." James felt his stomach drop. He knew Gabriella Chen by sight, had seen her in town with her father, a quiet Chinese man who kept mostly to himself. The girl herself was striking, with long black hair she wore in a practical braid and eyes that seemed to notice everything. She dressed in simple calico dresses, but moved with a confidence that suggested she was nobody's fool. He had watched her once in the general store discussing rock formations with the shopkeeper with more knowledge than most miners possessed. She could not have been more than 22 or 23, he figured. "When did she go down, Truris?" James asked, already turning toward the mine entrance on the eastern edge of town. "Her father says maybe 4 hours ago. He's been down there calling for her, but the main shaft branches in 12 directions. Some of them tunnels have been closed for 20 years. Frank's voice cracked. "There was heavy rain up in the mountains last night. If any of those old support timbers gave way near an underground stream..." James did not wait to hear more. He ran to his saddlebag and pulled out rope, matches, and a canteen, then sprinted toward the mine. His heart hammered against his ribs as his boots pounded the dirt road. Behind him, he heard Frank calling for more men, but James did not slow down. 4 hours was a long time to be lost in those tunnels, and if water had broken through, every minute mattered. At the mine entrance, he found Chen Wei pacing frantically, his face drawn with terror. "My daughter," the older man said in heavily accented English. "She wanted to see the eastern shaft. I told her no, but she is stubborn, like her mother." His voice broke on the last word. "I will find her," James said, meeting the man's desperate eyes. "Did you go down the eastern branch?" "Yes, but the water. It is coming up fast. I could not get through the 3rd junction. The tunnel is flooding." Chen Wei grabbed James's arm. "Please, she is all I have left in this world." James nodded once, grabbed one of the oil lamps hanging near the entrance, and descended into the darkness. The main shaft angled downward at a steep pitch supported by timber beams that groaned and creaked with age. Water trickled along the walls, and James could hear the distant roar that meant Chen Wei had been right about the flooding. He moved quickly, his lamp casting wild shadows on the rough-hewn rock walls. At the first junction, he paused to orient himself. The eastern shaft would be to his right. He could see boot prints in the mud, small prints that had to belong to Gabriella. Following them, he descended deeper, the air growing colder and damper. At the second junction, water pooled across the floor, already 6 inches deep. The roar was louder now, a rushing sound that spoke of serious flooding ahead. "Gabriella!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the tunnels. Gabriella Chen! For a moment, there was only the sound of water. Then, faint and desperate, he heard it. Help! I am here! The water is rising! James's pulse spiked. Her voice came from somewhere ahead and below, which meant she had gone deeper than the third junction. He waded forward, the water now reaching his shins. At the third junction, he saw what had stopped Chen Wei, a complete collapse of the tunnel ahead, with water pouring through gaps between fallen timber and rock. The main passage was entirely blocked. "Gabriella, can you hear me?" he called. "Yes." Her voice was clearer now, tinged with panic. "I am trapped in a side chamber. The water is up to my chest. I cannot get out. The entrance collapsed behind me." James's mind raced. If the main tunnel was blocked and her chamber entrance had collapsed, going back for help would take too long. The water was rising fast enough that she might have only minutes. He closed his eyes and tried to remember the mine layout from stories his father had told him years ago. The Feather River mine had been dug following silver veins that branched unpredictably through the rock. Many chambers connected through narrow fissures and secondary tunnels that the miners had used for ventilation. "Keep talking so I can find you," he shouted. "Tell me what you see." "There is water everywhere," Gabriella called back, and he could hear the fear straining her voice. "It is coming through cracks in the walls. There are old support beams overhead, and I can see tool marks on the walls. There is a bucket in the corner, and some rope, but it is old and rotten." James studied the collapsed tunnel, his lamp held high. Then he noticed something. A narrow gap near the ceiling where the timber had fallen at an angle, leaving a small opening. Water poured through it, but above the waterline, there might be space. It was too small for a man to fit through comfortably, but it was something. "I am going to find another way to you," he called. "How high is the water now?" There was a pause that made his chest tighten. "Almost to my shoulders," Gabriella answered, and he heard her voice waver. "I do not think I have much time." "You have time," James said firmly, forcing confidence into his voice. "I promise you I will get you out. Do not give up on me." He turned and ran back to the second junction, water splashing around his legs. His father had mentioned ventilation shafts, narrow tunnels that connected the lower chambers to upper levels. If he could find one that led to Gabriella's location, he might be able to reach her from above or from the side. The problem was that most of those shafts had never been properly mapped, and many had collapsed over the years. At the second junction, he took the left branch instead, holding his lamp up to study the ceiling. There, about 20 feet down the tunnel, he saw it. A dark opening in the ceiling barely 3 feet wide, a ventilation shaft. He had no way of knowing if it led toward Gabriella, but it was his best option. "Gabriella, I am trying something," he shouted, hoping his voice would carry. "Keep talking to me. Tell me about yourself. Where are you from?" For a moment there was silence, and terror gripped him. Then her voice came back, shakier now. "San Francisco originally. My mother died when I was 16. My father brought me here for his work. I help him with his research. I should have listened when he told me not to come down here alone." "You could not have known about the flooding," James called back. He secured his rope around a support beam and began climbing toward the ventilation shaft. The rock was slippery, and his boots struggled to find purchase. "What do you like to do when you're not exploring dangerous mines?" He heard a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "I read. I draw maps. I collect rock samples. I know it is not very ladylike, but I have always been fascinated by geology. My father says I have my mother's curiosity and his stubbornness." James pulled himself up into the ventilation shaft, his shoulders scraping against the rough stone walls. The passage was barely wide enough for him to crawl through, and he had to push his lamp ahead of him, dragging himself forward on his elbows. The air was stale and thick with the smell of earth and decay. "That sounds better than being ladylike," he grunted, trying to keep the conversation going as much to distract her as to orient himself by the sound of her voice. "I never had much use for people who did only what they were supposed to do." "Who are you?" Gabriella asked. "I do not even know the name of the person trying to save my life." "James Ashford. I am a ranch hand mostly. I herd cattle, break horses, do whatever work needs doing. Nothing as interesting as geology. You are crawling through a collapsed mine to save a stranger, Gabriella said, and her voice sounded closer now, though still muffled by rock and water. That seems interesting to me. The water is at my chin now, James Ashford. The fear in those last words spurred him forward. The ventilation shaft angled downward, then split into two directions. James paused, straining to hear over the sound of water. He shouted her name again. Here! I am here! The voice came from the right, and James took that branch, his lamp flickering wildly as he crawled. His knees and elbows were raw, his shoulders bruised from the narrow passage, but he kept moving. Then suddenly the shaft opened up, and he found himself looking down into a chamber below. Water filled it nearly to the top, and there, with her face barely above the surface, her arms clinging to a rotting support beam, was Gabriella Chen. Their eyes met in the lamplight, and James saw terror and desperate hope in her face. She was even more striking up close, despite the obvious fear. Her black hair floated around her shoulders, and her dark eyes were wide. She was shivering violently from the cold water. Hold on, James said. I'm coming down. He tied his rope securely around a rock outcropping, testing it with his weight. The chamber below was flooded almost to the ceiling, leaving only about 2 feet of airspace. Gabriella would have to go underwater to reach the rope, and then he would have to pull them both back up through the ventilation shaft. It was risky, but it was the only option. I need you to listen carefully, James said, keeping his voice steady. I am going to lower a rope down. The water is too high for me to climb down to you, so you're going to have to let go of that beam, swim to the rope, and tie it around your waist. Can you do that? Gabriella's teeth were chattering. I think so, but the current is strong. When the water first broke through, it swept me off my feet. I barely made it to this beam. I know you are scared, but I have got you, James said, meeting her eyes. I will not let go of this rope. I swear it on my life. Something in his voice must have reached her because she nodded. James lowered the rope, feeding it down until it touched the water's surface. Gabriella would have to duck under to reach it. On the count of 3, James said. 1, 2, 3. Gabriella took a deep breath and let go of the beam. She disappeared beneath the dark water, and James's heart stopped. Seconds felt like hours. Then her head broke the surface again, gasping, and she had the rope in her hands. She fumbled with it, her fingers clearly numb from the cold, but managed to loop it around her waist and tie a knot. I have got it, she called up, her voice weak. Hold tight, James said. He began to pull, hand over hand, his muscles straining. Gabriella's weight, combined with the drag of the water, made it brutally hard work, but he gritted his teeth and kept pulling. Slowly, inch by inch, she rose out of the water. When her shoulders cleared the surface, she reached up and grabbed the rock wall, trying to help. There is a foothold to your left, James called down. Can you reach it? Gabriella stretched out her leg, her boots scrabbling against the wet stone. She found the foothold and pushed up, and James pulled harder. His shoulders burned and his hands were raw, but he did not stop. Finally, she was close enough that he could reach down and grab her arm. With one last heave, he pulled her up into the ventilation shaft beside him. For a moment, they both just lay there, gasping for breath. Gabriella was soaking wet and shaking uncontrollably. James shrugged out of his jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders, even though it would do little good in the damp cold of the tunnel. We need to keep moving, he said gently. Can you crawl? Gabriella nodded, her teeth chattering too hard for her to speak. James went first, pushing the lamp ahead of him, with Gabriella following close behind. The journey back through the ventilation shaft was agonizing. Every few feet, James paused to make sure Gabriella was still with him, and each time he heard her labored breathing, his determination hardened. He was going to get her out of here. When they finally emerged back into the main tunnel, James helped Gabriella down from the shaft. Her legs nearly gave out when her feet hit the ground and he caught her around the waist. "Easy," he said. "I have got you." She looked up at him, water dripping from her hair, her face pale, but her eyes clear. "You saved my life." "Not yet," James said. "We still need to get out of here." But as they started back toward the entrance, Gabriella's strength began to fail. The combination of cold water, terror, and exhaustion was taking its toll. She stumbled, and James caught her again. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I cannot seem to make my legs work properly." James did not hesitate. He swept her up into his arms, carrying her against his chest. She was light, even soaking wet, and he moved as quickly as he could through the tunnels. Behind them, he could hear the water still rising, flooding through the chambers they had just left. The climb back to the surface seemed to take forever, but finally James saw daylight ahead. He emerged from the mine entrance to find a crowd waiting. Chen Wei rushed forward with a cry of relief, and other men moved to help. Someone brought blankets, and another person ran for the doctor. James set Gabriella down gently, making sure she was steady before he let go. Her father embraced her, speaking rapidly in Chinese, tears streaming down his face. Gabriella answered him in the same language, her voice hoarse but steady. Then she turned to look at James over her father's shoulder. "Thank you," she said in English. "I owe you everything." James felt his face grow warm. "I am just glad we got you out in time." The doctor arrived and insisted on examining Gabriella immediately. She was suffering from cold exposure and exhaustion, but had no serious injuries. He prescribed rest, warm food, and dry clothes. Chen Wei thanked James profusely, pressing coins into his hand that James tried to refuse. Eventually, he accepted them only to stop the older man from embarrassing himself. As the crowd dispersed and Gabriella was taken to the doctor's office, James found himself standing alone near the mine entrance, his clothes still damp, his body aching. Frank Morrison clapped him on the shoulder. "You are a hero, boy," the old man said. "That was some brave work you did in there." James shook his head. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Frank said seriously. "Most men would have waited for help or declared it too dangerous. You went in alone and found a way when there did not seem to be one. That girl owes you her life." James walked back to the livery stable in a daze, retrieved his mare, and rode to the small cabin he rented on the outskirts of town. He peeled off his wet clothes, washed the mine dust from his skin, and collapsed onto his bed, but sleep did not come easily. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Gabriella's face in the lamplight, saw the trust in her eyes as she let go of the beam and reached for his rope. 3 days passed before James saw Gabriella again. He had been busy with work at the ranch, helping to move cattle to fresh pasture, and he told himself that was why he had not gone into town to check on her. The truth was that he felt strangely nervous about seeing her again, though he could not quite explain why. On the 4th day, he rode into Oroville for supplies and was tying his horse outside the general store when he heard his name called. He turned to find Gabriella walking toward him, looking completely recovered from her ordeal. She wore a simple blue dress and carried a woven basket over one arm. Her black hair was neatly braided, and color had returned to her cheeks. "Mr. Ashford," she said, smiling, "I was hoping I might run into you. I wanted to thank you properly when I was not half drowned and terrified." James felt his mouth go dry. Up close in the sunlight, she was breathtakingly beautiful. "Miss Chen, I am glad to see you are well." "Thanks to you," she said. "My father and I would like to invite you to dinner tonight if you are free. We live in the house behind the assayer's office. It would mean a great deal to us." James wanted to refuse, to keep his distance, but the hope in her eyes made that impossible. "I would be honored," he said. That evening, James put on his cleanest shirt and best trousers, feeling foolish as he did so. It was just a thank you dinner, nothing more. But as he walked to the Chen house, his heart beat faster than it had any right to. Chen Wei opened the door with a warm smile and ushered James inside. The house was small, but immaculately kept, with books lining shelves on every wall and rock samples arranged on tables and windowsills. The smell of cooking food made James's stomach growl. Gabriella emerged from the kitchen, and James felt something shift in his chest. She had changed into a green dress that brought out the warmth in her dark eyes, and she had pinned her hair up in an elegant style that showed the graceful line of her neck. "Welcome to our home," she said. "I hope you like Chinese food. My father and I prepared some of our favorite dishes." The meal was unlike anything James had tasted before. There was rice and vegetables cooked with ginger and garlic, tender chicken in a savory sauce, and dumplings that melted in his mouth. Throughout dinner, Chen Wei asked James about his life, his work, and his family. James found himself talking more than he usually did, drawn out by the older man's genuine interest and Gabriella's attentive gaze. After dinner, Chen Wei excused himself to his study, claiming he had correspondence to finish, but James suspected the man was deliberately leaving him alone with Gabriella. She served tea, and they sat in the small parlor, the lamplight casting a warm glow. "I need you to know," Gabriella said quietly, "that I understand what you did for me. You risked your life when you had no obligation to do so. Most people would not have done that, especially not for someone like me." James frowned. "What do you mean, someone like you?" Gabriella met his eyes. "A Chinese woman. We are not always treated well in California mining towns, Mr. Ashford. I am not naive about that." "Call me James," he said, "and I did not think about any of that. I only thought about getting you out before the water rose too high." "That is what makes it even more remarkable," Gabriella said softly. "You saw a person in danger and you helped. That says everything about who you are." James felt heat rise in his face. "You would have done the same if our positions were reversed." "Perhaps," Gabriella said, "but I hope I never have to find out." She paused, then added, "I have been thinking about something. That mine shaft where I was trapped. The water must have broken through from an underground stream that was swollen from spring runoff. But the geological formation suggested there might be a significant silver vein in that area, untouched because it was considered too dangerous to mine." James leaned forward, interested despite himself. "You could tell all that while you were busy drowning?" Gabriella's lips curved in a smile. "I have a one-track mind when it comes to geology. My father says it will be the death of me, and he was nearly right, but I made sketches of the rock formations in the chamber, and I have been comparing them to my father's maps. I think there is something significant down there." "Even if there is, how would anyone get to it?" James asked. "Those lower tunnels will be flooded for weeks, maybe months." "There might be another entrance," Gabriella said, her eyes lighting up with excitement. "The ventilation shaft you used to reach me must connect to the surface somewhere. If we could find that opening and trace the shaft system, we might be able to access the lower chambers from a different direction." James should have said no. He should have told her that he had no interest in risking his life in mines again, that he was a rancher, not a prospector. But the enthusiasm in Gabriella's voice was infectious, and he found himself asking, "How would we find the surface opening?" For the next hour, they pored over Chen Wei's maps and Gabriella's sketches, their heads bent close together as they traced possible routes for the ventilation system. James was acutely aware of her presence beside him, the scent of her hair, the way her hand occasionally brushed his as she pointed to different features on the maps. When he finally left that night, he walked home in a daze, his mind full of geological formations and ventilation shafts, but mostly full of Gabriella Chen. Over the next 2 weeks, James found himself spending more and more time with Gabriella. On his days off from the ranch, he would help her search the hillsides above the mine for the ventilation shaft openings. They would pack food and water and spend entire days scrambling over rocks and through brush, talking about everything and nothing. Gabriella told him about growing up in San Francisco's Chinese community, about her mother who had been a teacher and had insisted her daughter receive a proper education, about coming to California from China as a child and learning to navigate between two cultures. James found himself sharing things he had never told anyone. How lonely his childhood had been after his parents died, how he had drifted from job to job, never quite finding a place where he belonged, how sometimes he wondered if he would spend his whole life on the margins of other people's stories. "I do not think you are on the margins," Gabriella said one afternoon as they sat resting on a sun-warmed boulder. "I think you are the kind of person who steps up when it matters most. You just have not found the right story yet." Her words struck something deep in James's chest, and he turned to look at her. She was gazing out at the valley below, the wind tugging strands of hair loose from her braid. Without thinking, he reached out and tucked one of those strands behind her ear. She turned to meet his gaze, and the air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken feeling. "Gabriella," James said quietly. Before he could continue, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was gentle and tentative, and it set his entire world spinning. When she pulled back, her cheeks were flushed. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "That was too forward. I should not have." "Do not apologize," James said, his voice rough. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her again, deeper this time, pouring everything he felt into that moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I have been wanting to do that for days." "Me too," Gabriella whispered. They sat together on that boulder as the sun began to set, holding hands and talking about the future. James admitted that he had started to hope his future might include her in it, and Gabriella confessed that she had been thinking the same thing. It seemed impossible that such a short time ago they had been strangers, but James could not imagine his life without her anymore. A week later, Gabriella found the ventilation shaft opening. It was nearly invisible, hidden behind a rock fall on the hillside above the mine. James helped her clear away the debris, and they peered down into darkness. Cool, damp air flowed up from below, confirming that the shaft connected to the lower tunnels. "This is it," Gabriella breathed. "James, we could actually do this. We could access those lower chambers." But James was looking at the unstable rock around the opening, the way the edges crumbled when he tested them with his boot. "It is too dangerous," he said firmly. "Gabriella, I almost lost you once. I will not risk it again." She turned to him, her expression serious. "I know it is dangerous, but if there really is silver down there, it could mean everything for my father and me. We could finally have financial security. We could stop moving from town to town, chasing his consulting work. Or you could die in a cave-in," James said bluntly. "No amount of silver is worth that." They argued about it on the walk back to town, their first real disagreement. Gabriella accused him of being overprotective, and James countered that she was being reckless. They parted that evening without resolving anything, and James spent a sleepless night worrying that he had ruined everything between them. The next morning, Chen Wei came to find James at the ranch. The older man's face was grave as he asked to speak with James privately. They walked to the pasture fence, and Chen Wei stood looking out at the grazing cattle. "My daughter told me about the ventilation shaft," he said. "She also told me that you argued about exploring it further." "Sir, I mean no disrespect," James began, but Chen Wei held up his hand. "You were right to caution her," the older man said. "Gabriella has her mother's courage, but sometimes courage crosses into foolishness. I have told her the same thing you did. The risk is too great." He paused. "But I also understand her desire for security. Since my wife died, it has been only the two of us. If something were to happen to me, Gabriella would have very little to support herself. Chinese women have few opportunities in this country." James felt a weight settle in his chest. "What are you saying?" Chen Wei turned to face him. "I am saying that I see the way my daughter looks at you, and the way you look at her. I am not a fool, Mr. Ashford. If you care for Gabriella, you need to understand that providing for her future is something that weighs heavily on both our minds." "I do care for her," James said quietly. "More than I have ever cared for anyone." "Then help me find a way to make her feel secure enough that she does not have to risk her life in dangerous mines," Chen Wei said simply. Over the next few days, James thought hard about Chen Wei's words. His savings from 6 years of ranch work amounted to a few $100s, enough to buy a small piece of land, but not enough to build a life on. He made decent money as a ranch hand, but it was not the kind of income that would give Gabriella the security she deserved. He was still wrestling with these thoughts when he rode into town the following Saturday and found the main street buzzing with excitement. People clustered in groups, talking animatedly, and James caught fragments of conversation about a new silver strike up in the northern hills. He dismounted and asked Frank Morrison what was happening. "Big discovery," Frank said, his eyes bright. "Group of prospectors found a vein up near Bear Creek that is testing out richer than anything the Feather River mine ever produced. They're calling it the Sierra Queen, and folks are saying it could be as big as the Comstock lode." James felt his pulse quicken. "Are they hiring miners?" "Sure are," Frank said. "Paying top dollar too. $2 a day for experienced men and bonuses if they hit good ore. Why, you thinking about signing on?" James nodded slowly. Mining was dangerous work, but it paid better than ranching. And if he worked hard for a year or two, he could save enough to buy land and build a house. It was a gamble, but it was also an opportunity. That evening he went to the Chen house and asked to speak with Gabriella and her father together. When they were all seated in the parlor, James took a deep breath. "I have been thinking about what you said," he told Chen Wei, "about security and the future. I want you both to know that my intentions toward Gabriella are serious. I want to build a life with her if she will have me." Gabriella's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with surprise and joy. Chen Wei's expression remained neutral, but James thought he saw approval in the older man's eyes. "I do not have much to offer right now," James continued, "but they are hiring at the new Sierra Queen mine and the pay is good. If I work there for a year, maybe two, I can save enough to buy land and build a house, a real home." "James," Gabriella said softly, "you do not have to do that." "I want to," James said, meeting her gaze. "I want to give you the kind of life you deserve, but I need to know if you will wait for me, if you will trust me to build something worth coming home to." Gabriella rose and crossed to him, taking his hands in hers. "I would wait for you however long it took," she said, "but only if you promise to be careful, only if you promise to come back to me." "I promise," James said, and pulled her into his arms. Chen Wei cleared his throat delicately. "There is still the matter of proper courting, Mr. Ashford. My daughter is a respectable young woman." James released Gabriella, his face burning. "Of course, sir. I apologize. I got carried away." But Chen Wei was smiling. "I will leave you two alone to talk," he said, "but keep the door open, please." After her father left, Gabriella sat close to James on the sofa, her hand in his. "Are you certain about the mine work?" she asked. "I know how you feel about mines after what happened." "I am certain about you," James said. "Everything else, I will figure out." They spent the next few hours making plans and dreaming about the future. James would start at the Sierra Queen mine in a week. He would work hard, save his money, and visit Gabriella whenever he could. In a year, if all went well, they would be married. It seemed like a solid plan, and James felt more hopeful than he had in years. True to his word, James started work at the Sierra Queen mine the following Monday. The work was brutal, and the hours were long, but the pay was everything Frank had promised. James sent most of his earnings to a bank account in Sacramento, keeping only enough to cover his basic expenses. Every other Sunday, he rode the 15 miles back to Oroville to see Gabriella, and those visits became the bright spots in his life. Gabriella wrote him letters that he read and reread until the paper was soft from handling. She told him about her work with her father, about new rock samples they had collected, about the books she was reading. She filled the letters with small observations about life in Oroville, and James treasured every word. In return, he wrote to her about the mine, about the men he worked with, about the land he was scouting for their future home. 6 months passed, then 8. James's body grew hard and strong from the physical labor, and his savings account grew steadily. He had enough now to buy a decent piece of land, and he had his eye on a beautiful spot along the Feather River, 20 acres with water access and good grazing for cattle. The owner was willing to sell for a fair price, and James was close to making an offer. Then in late November, disaster struck the Sierra Queen mine. James was working in the lower tunnels when he heard a crack like thunder. The support timbers above him groaned, and he knew instantly what was happening. He shouted a warning and ran for the exit as rock began to fall. The other miners scrambled for safety, but one man, a young fellow named Peter who had only been working there a month, slipped and fell. James turned back without thinking, grabbed Peter by the arm, and hauled him toward the exit. They made it through just as a section of the tunnel collapsed behind them, filling the air with dust and debris. Peter was unhurt, but James had wrenched his shoulder badly in the rescue. The mine doctor examined him and declared that he would need at least a month to heal properly, maybe more. James's heart sank. A month without pay would set back his plans significantly, and there was no guarantee the mine would hold his position. He rode back to Oroville that evening, his shoulder throbbing, to tell Gabriella what had happened. She opened the door and took one look at his face before pulling him inside. "What happened?" she demanded. James explained about the collapse and his injury. Gabriella's face went pale, and she made him sit down while she examined his shoulder with gentle hands. "You could have been killed," she said, her voice shaking. "But I was not," James said, "and neither was Peter. That is what matters." "What matters is that you keep throwing yourself into danger," Gabriella said, and there were tears in her eyes now. "First you saved me from the mine. Now you save this other man. When will you think about your own safety?" James cupped her face in his good hand. "I was thinking about my safety. If I had left Peter there, I would have had to live with that for the rest of my life. I could not do it." Gabriella closed her eyes, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I know. That is who you are, but it terrifies me." Chen Wei came into the room then, took one look at the situation, and immediately insisted that James stay with them while he recovered. James protested, but the older man would not hear of it. For the next week, James lived in the Chen household, sleeping in their small guest room while his shoulder healed. Gabriella tended to him with a combination of medical skill and tender concern that made his heart ache. During his recovery, James spent long hours talking with Chen Wei about geology, mining, and land management. The older man had a wealth of knowledge, and James soaked it up like a sponge. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Chen Wei made an unexpected proposal. "I have been thinking, Mr. Ashford," he said, "when you buy your land, you will need help making it productive. I have some savings set aside, and I've been considering investing in property myself. What if we became partners? You provide the labor and the vision for the ranch, and I provide additional capital and my expertise in evaluating the land's mineral resources. We split the profits accordingly." James stared at him. "You would do that? Partner with me?" "You saved my daughter's life," Chen Wei said simply. "You have proven yourself to be a man of integrity and courage. Yes, I would do that. Besides," he added with a small smile, "in a year or two we will be family. It makes sense to build something together." The partnership changed everything. With Chen Wei's additional capital, James could buy not just the 20 acres he had been eyeing, but 40 acres that included the original plot plus additional land with timber resources and better access to the river. They signed the papers in January of 1883, and James took possession of his first real home. The next months were a blur of activity. James hired workers to help him build a house, sturdy and simple but well-made, with 3 bedrooms and a wide front porch. He built a barn and corrals for cattle. He planted a garden that Gabriella designed, with vegetables and herbs and even some flowers. Chen Wei used his geological knowledge to locate the best spot for a well, and they struck water at only 30 feet. By April, the house was finished, and James went to Chen Wei to ask formally for permission to marry Gabriella. The older man gave his blessing without hesitation, and James presented Gabriella with a simple gold ring he had purchased in Sacramento. "It is not fancy," he said, as he slipped it onto her finger, "but it is real, and it is yours, and so am I." Gabriella threw her arms around his neck, laughing and crying at the same time. "It is perfect. You are perfect. I cannot believe this is really happening." They were married in May, in a simple ceremony at the small church in Oroville. A few townspeople attended, mostly those who had been there the day James pulled Gabriella from the mine. Frank Morrison stood as James's witness, and Chen Wei walked his daughter down the aisle with tears streaming down his face. Gabriella wore a white dress she had sewn herself with delicate embroidery at the cuffs and collar, and James thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. After the ceremony, they held a small celebration at the new house. Chen Wei had moved into one of the bedrooms, and he had decorated the main room with lanterns and flowers from the garden. There was food and music, and James danced with his new wife under the stars, feeling like the luckiest man alive. That night, alone in their bedroom for the first time as husband and wife, James held Gabriella close and marveled at how much his life had changed in just 1 year. From the moment he had heard her voice calling for help from that flooded mine shaft, his entire world had shifted. He had found his purpose, his home, and the person he wanted to spend his life with. "What are you thinking?" Gabriella asked, her head resting on his chest. "I am thinking that I would crawl through 1,000 mine shafts if it meant finding my way to you," James said. Gabriella tilted her face up to kiss him. "Let us hope you never have to. I prefer you here, safe, with me." "I am not going anywhere," James promised. The first year of married life was full of hard work and quiet joy. James raised cattle and horses, building his herd slowly and carefully. Gabriella helped with the ranch work when she could, but she also continued her geological studies with her father, and together they discovered several small mineral deposits on the property that they were able to lease to mining companies for steady additional income. Chen Wei thrived on the ranch. His health improving in the clean air and peaceful surroundings, he taught James more about land management and geology, and in return, James taught him about ranching and animal husbandry. The two men developed a deep respect and affection for each other, and James felt like he had gained the father he had lost so many years ago. In the spring of 1884, Gabriella discovered she was pregnant. James was both thrilled and terrified, hovering over her like a worried mother hen until she finally told him to stop fussing and let her work. The pregnancy was healthy and uncomplicated, and in December, Gabriella gave birth to a son. They named him Wei after her father, and James held his newborn son with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the fierce love that flooded through him. "He is perfect," James whispered, touching the baby's tiny fingers. "He is ours," Gabriella said, exhausted but radiant. "Our family." Chen Wei was a devoted grandfather, doting on little Wei with unabashed joy. The house rang with the sounds of a baby's cries and laughter, and James could not imagine being happier. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family. They named her Lily, and she had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin. With 2 small children, the house was chaotic and loud and absolutely perfect. James would come in from working the ranch to find Gabriella reading to the children, or Chen Wei teaching them Chinese words, or both children napping in a pile on the porch with the dog James had brought home from town. As the years passed, the ranch prospered. James earned a reputation as an honest dealer and a skilled rancher, and his cattle brought top prices at market. The mineral leases provided steady income, and Chen Wei invested wisely, growing their savings. By 1890, they owned 80 acres outright with another 40 under lease, and employed 3 full-time ranch hands. The children grew strong and healthy, Wei serious and thoughtful like his grandfather, Lily adventurous and bold like her mother. James taught them to ride and rope, while Gabriella taught them to read and write and think. Chen Wei taught them about rocks and stars and the stories of their Chinese heritage. The family was a blend of cultures and traditions, and it worked beautifully. One evening in late summer of 1893, James sat on the porch watching the sunset with Gabriella beside him. The children were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze. Chen Wei was in his rocking chair, dozing peacefully. James took Gabriella's hand and squeezed it gently. "Do you remember the day we met?" he asked. Gabriella smiled. "You mean the day I nearly drowned in a mine shaft?" "Yes, I remember." "I remember thinking I had never been so scared in my life," James said, And then I saw your face when I found you, and I knew I would do anything to save you." "You did save me," Gabriella said, "in more ways than you know. Before I met you, I felt lost, like I did not quite belong anywhere. My father and I were always moving, always temporary. You gave me a home, James, a real home." "We built it together," James said. "You and me and your father. This whole life, we built it together." Gabriella leaned her head on his shoulder. "I love you, James Ashford. I loved you from the moment you promised you would not let go of that rope." "I love you too," James said, "and I never will let go. Not ever." They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Wei came running up to the porch, excited about a frog he had found by the creek, and Lily followed close behind, demanding to see. James listened to his children's excited chatter and felt Gabriella's warmth beside him, and he thought about the strange path his life had taken. 11 years ago, he had been a lonely ranch hand with no family and no prospects. Then a young woman had gotten trapped in a flooding mine, and in saving her, he had saved himself. He had found love, purpose, family, and home, all because he had been willing to crawl through a dark tunnel toward a voice calling for help. Later that night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, James and Gabriella lay together in the darkness of their room. She traced patterns on his chest with her fingers, and he played with her long black hair, now streaked with a few strands of silver. "What do you think the next 10 years will bring?" Gabriella asked sleepily. "More of this, I hope," James said. "More family, more love, more life. Maybe we will expand the ranch. Maybe the children will take over someday. Whatever comes, as long as we face it together, I know it will be good." "Together," Gabriella agreed, and kissed him softly. The years continued to roll by, each one bringing its own challenges and joys. In 1895, Chen Wei fell ill with pneumonia, and for a terrifying week, they thought they might lose him. But the old man rallied, stubbornly refusing to give up, and recovered fully. Though he moved a bit slower afterward, the scare reminded them all to treasure every moment they had together. Wei grew into a thoughtful teenager with his grandfather's love of learning and his father's strong work ethic. He talked about going to college one day to study engineering, and James and Gabriella encouraged him, determined that their children would have opportunities they had never had. Lily grew into a spirited young girl who loved the ranch and everything about it. She could rope a calf as well as any of the ranch hands by the time she was 12, and she had her mother's courage and her father's determination. In 1898, James and Gabriella celebrated their 15th wedding anniversary with a trip to San Francisco, leaving the children in Chen Wei's capable care. It was the first time they had been away from the ranch and the children together, and they enjoyed the city's restaurants and theaters like young lovers. Walking through Chinatown, Gabriella showed James the neighborhood where she had grown up, pointing out the school she had attended and the market where her mother had shopped. "I am glad we left," Gabriella said as they stood looking at her old apartment building. "I am glad we found Oroville and the mine and each other. This was my past, but you and the children and the ranch, that is my future." "Our future," James corrected, pulling her close. "Always our future." They returned to the ranch refreshed and more in love than ever, ready to face whatever the new century might bring. And when 1900 arrived, bringing with it a new era, the Ashford family was stronger than ever. Chen Wei lived to see his grandchildren graduate from school, Wei heading off to college in San Francisco and Lily taking over more responsibilities on the ranch. The old man passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1903 at the age of 72, surrounded by the family he loved. They buried him on a hillside overlooking the ranch, where he could watch over the land he had helped to build. Gabriella grieved deeply for her father, but she took comfort in knowing he had lived his final years in happiness and peace. James held her through the dark nights when the loss felt overwhelming, and gradually the sharp edge of grief softened into gentle remembrance. Wei returned from college in 1905 with a degree in civil engineering, and a young wife named Sarah. He took a job in Sacramento but visited the ranch often, bringing news of the city and the changing world. Lily met a young rancher named Thomas from the neighboring property, and in 1907 they were married in the same church where James and Gabriella had exchanged their vows. Thomas moved to the Ashford Ranch, and he and Lily took over more of the daily operations, allowing James and Gabriella to slow down a bit. In 1908, Lily gave birth to James and Gabriella's first grandchild, a baby girl they named Grace. Holding his granddaughter for the first time, James felt the same overwhelming love he had experienced when Way and Lily were born, magnified by the joy of seeing his own daughter become a mother. "She looks like you," he told Gabriella, who stood beside him with tears streaming down her face. "She looks like all of us," Gabriella said, "like family." Way and Sarah had their first child the following year, a boy named Robert, and suddenly the ranch house was filled with the sounds of children again. James built a second house on the property for Lily and Thomas, and the two households worked the ranch together, creating a true family enterprise. As James approached his 50th birthday in 1910, he found himself reflecting more and more on the strange and wonderful journey his life had taken. From an orphaned boy to a drifting ranch hand to a respected rancher and patriarch of a thriving family, he had traveled further than he ever could have imagined. And all of it had started with a voice crying for help from a flooded mine shaft. One afternoon in early spring, James saddled his horse and rode up to the hillside where the old Feather River mine entrance still stood, sealed now and overgrown with brush. He had not been back here in years, had actively avoided it, but something drew him now. He dismounted and walked to the entrance, remembering that desperate April day 28 years ago when he had run into the darkness to save a woman he had never met. "Thank you," he said aloud to the silent mine. "Thank you for bringing her into my life." He heard footsteps behind him and turned to find Gabriella walking up the hill, leading her own horse. She smiled when she saw his face. "I thought I might find you here," she said, coming to stand beside him. "I've been thinking about it too. This place where everything started." "I would do it again," James said. "1,000 times over, I would crawl through that shaft to find you." Gabriella took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "I know you would. That is who you are. My brave, wonderful, stubborn cowboy who would not give up." They stood together looking at the old mine entrance, and James felt a sense of peace settle over him. His life had been shaped by a single moment of choice, the decision to go into that mine alone when any reasonable person would have waited for help. He had followed his instincts and his heart, and it had led him to everything that mattered. "Come on," Gabriella said, tugging his hand. "Let us go home. Grace and Robert will be waiting for their grandparents to tell them a story before bed." James let her lead him back to the horses, and they rode home together as the sun began to set over the ranch. The house came into view, warm light glowing from the windows, and James could see figures moving inside. His family, his home, his life. That evening, with both grandchildren settled on his lap, James told them a story. It was a story they had heard before, but they never tired of it. He told them about a brave young woman who went into a mine to study rocks and got trapped by rising water. He told them about a cowboy who heard her cries for help and found a way to reach her when there seemed to be no way. He told them about rope and courage, about trust and determination, about two people who found each other in the darkness and built a life in the light. "And then what happened, Grandpa?" Grace asked, even though she knew the answer. "Then they fell in love," James said, meeting Gabriella's eyes across the room. "And they lived happily ever after with a family and a ranch and more blessings than they could count." "Is it true?" Robert asked. "Every word," Gabriella said softly. "It is all true." Later, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, James and Gabriella sat on their porch in the rocking chairs they had bought for their 10th anniversary. The stars were bright overhead, and a cool breeze carried the scent of spring flowers from the garden. "Do you ever wonder how different our lives would be if I had not gone into that mine that day?" Gabriella asked. James considered the question. "Sometimes," But then I remember that it was not just chance. You went into that mine because you were curious and brave. I went in after you because I could not stand by and do nothing. We were always going to find each other, one way or another. The mine just brought us together sooner." "I like that thought," Gabriella said, "that we were meant to find each other." "I know we were," James said. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Gabriella Ashford. Then, now, and always." She reached over and took his hand, and they sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and the horses nickered softly in the barn. The night air was cool and sweet, and James felt utterly content. As the years continued to pass, the ranch continued to thrive under the combined efforts of the family. Lily and Thomas expanded the cattle operation while Way used his engineering skills to improve the irrigation system and build better facilities. More grandchildren arrived, and then, as time marched on, great-grandchildren, filling the ranch with noise and laughter and life. James and Gabriella grew old together, their hair turning white, their hands becoming gnarled with arthritis, but their love never diminishing. They took walks together every evening that weather permitted, holding hands like young sweethearts, talking about their day and their family and their blessings. Sometimes they would walk up to Chen Wei's grave and tell him about the grandchildren and great-grandchildren he would have loved to know. Sometimes they would walk to the edge of the property and look out at the land they had built together, marveling at how far they had come. In the spring of 1925, on their 42nd wedding anniversary, James and Gabriella renewed their vows in a small ceremony attended by their entire family. 3 generations stood witness as the elderly couple exchanged the same simple rings they had worn for 4 decades, their voices steady and sure as they promised once again to love and honor each other for as long as they both should live. "I would choose you again," James said, his voice cracking with emotion. "In every life, in every world, I would choose you." "And I would choose you," Gabriella replied, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "My rescuer, my partner, my love, always you." They sealed their renewed vows with a kiss, and their family erupted in cheers and applause. Wei, now a distinguished engineer with silver threading his dark hair, wiped tears from his eyes. Lily, strong and sun-bronzed from years of ranch work, beamed with pride. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren surrounded them with hugs and well wishes, and James felt his heart so full of love he thought it might burst. That night, lying in bed together as they had for 42 years, James stroked Gabriella's silver hair and whispered, "We did it. We built something beautiful." "We did," Gabriella agreed, "and it will continue after us. Our children and grandchildren will keep building, keep loving, keep living. That is our real legacy, James. Not just the land or the ranch, but the love we taught them, the courage to take risks, the strength to keep going, the wisdom to know what really matters." "I could not have done any of it without you, James said. "And I could not have done it without you," Gabriella replied. "We were always meant to be a team." They fell asleep holding each other, and if the sleep was deeper and more peaceful than usual, neither of them minded. They had lived full lives, rich with love and purpose, and they had no regrets. James Ashford passed away peacefully in his sleep in the autumn of 1928, at the age of 68. Gabriella held his hand as he took his last breath, and she did not cry. Instead, she smiled because she knew that her brave cowboy had simply gone on ahead, and she would follow when her time came. She had loved him for 46 years, and she would love him for whatever came after. Gabriella lived another 5 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, telling stories about James and their adventures, keeping his memory alive and vibrant. She continued to work in the garden he had built for her, continued to study the rocks and minerals she loved, continued to live fully until the end. When she passed away in the spring of 1933 at the age of 73, she was buried beside James on the hillside where they had buried Chen Wei. The entire family gathered for the funeral. 3 generations standing together on the land that James and Gabriella had built with love and determination. They told stories about the 2 people who had met because of a flooded mine shaft and created a dynasty through their courage and love. Wei stood at his mother's grave and told the assembled family about the day his father had crawled through a collapsing mine to save a woman he had never met. He talked about how that single act of courage had shaped all of their lives, had created the family and the ranch and the legacy they all shared. They taught us that love is an action, not just a feeling, Wei said, his voice strong despite his tears. They showed us that courage means doing the right thing even when you are afraid. They proved that 2 people from different worlds could build something beautiful together if they were willing to work for it. That is their gift to us. That is what we must carry forward. The family stood together as the sun set over the ranch, the same sun that had set over James and Gabriella so many times before. And in the gathering darkness, as the first stars began to appear, it was easy to imagine 2 figures walking hand in hand through the fields they had loved, together again at last, their love story complete and perfect and eternal. The ranch continued to thrive for generations after, passed down through the family, a living testament to what James and Gabriella had built. The story of the cowboy and the woman trapped in the mine became family legend, told and retold to each new generation, a reminder of where they came from and what they were capable of. And sometimes on quiet spring evenings when the air was cool and sweet, people working on the ranch would swear they could hear laughter carried on the breeze and see 2 figures walking together through the twilight, holding hands and whispering words of love that would echo through eternity. The story that had begun with a scream in a flooded mine shaft had become a legacy of love that would never die, proof that sometimes the most terrifying moments lead to the most beautiful lives, and that true love, once found, never truly ends.